Welcome to our very special first episode on our very special guest Saturday here on Sport Report, brought to you by Sportlight. As always, my co-host Dr. G and I are bringing you the best of the best in sport knowledge. And today we bring in Dr. J. Coakley, renowned sports sociologist and professor of sociology at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. Jay has spent over 45 years getting ready for this interview, sort of, and is going to help us put the spotlight on sports sociology.
Hey, Meg and Dr. G here for Sportlight, and we are so excited to have the renowned sports sociologist, Dr. J. Coakley, from the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, with us today. Jay spent more than 45 years studying sports culture, and his textbook, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies, is in its 13th edition and is likely the most widely used text in the world on sports sociology. It has been translated into multiple languages, including Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and as an international respected scholar, author, and journal editor, Jay has received many awards on his journey to make sports participation a source of enjoyment and development for young people around the world. Jay, welcome. We're delighted to have you join us today to put the spotlight on sport sociology.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Jay. I think as a new show, too, having somebody with your reputation, and for those looking to understand sport better, your Sport and Society textbook for all the listeners, it's monumental. I mean, you know the history of sociology of sport, and you published the first edition, in 1970?
78.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so at that time, too, there weren't very many other textbooks. There was, you and George Sage and Stanley Eitzen were starting really the sociology of sport and producing those things, and Harry Edwards.
In fact, 3 sociology of sport textbooks came out in 1978 simultaneously.
What was happening in the 70s then that everybody was writing those books?
I think that commercialization was having major impact on how sports were organized, how people defined sports, how young people saw their future in sports, and people started asking some critical questions about how sports were organized, where they were going, what they should be like in the future, and that excited people with backgrounds in sociology to start looking at sport with a critical eye.
Yeah, they might not know what do you mean by critical eye?
Asking questions about sport related to who plays, under what conditions, who's excluded, whose games get to count within society in terms of how they're funded, supported, and promoted, and turned into official activities, for example, in school systems and in university athletic programs. And also, who has the power to make those decisions, and what are the power dynamics that are associated with sports and society? Well, basically, a sports sociologist studies the connections between sports and the culture and society within which sports exist. And they also focus on the social worlds that are created in and around sports. So basically, we're concerned with how society and culture influence how sport is organized and who gets to play, who doesn't, who's excluded, how sports are promoted, how they're covered in the media, and we also look at the links between sport and gender relations in society, race and ethnic relations, socioeconomic class, and age and ability issues, who gets access to sport under what conditions. And then when we look at sport itself, we're concerned with issues related to deviance and violence and labor issues. So we look at the whole connection between sports and the economy and politics and education and the media. So it's a pretty inclusive field.
Yeah.
Those things sound like things that have changed quite a bit over the last 45 years as you've been studying this.
Yeah, it's, when sports were first organized in the late 19th and early 20th century, They basically had a reality that was confined to the locality within which they exist. But since that time, sports have become increasingly institutionalized, and that's a sociological term that basically means that they've become more formalized. The rules have become more standardized. The game looks the same in various places where it's played. So sports have basically become more organized over the past century and a half, and now we're starting to critique that organization.
Has that happened more in the U.S. than in other countries? Has it? Thinking about soccer, you go to a lot of Latin American countries, and they still have, the pickup game, and everyone has a soccer ball, and they're just out having fun with soccer. And yet, in the U.S., my experience, my daughter plays soccer, and she's constantly, having to have a field, have a team together. Are you on club? Are you on, AYSO? It just seems like the organization has kind of taken it over.
Yeah, that's happened over the past 40 years, and basically in the United States, we've seen what some people refer to as the death of the culture of childhood play. And along with that, there's been far fewer informal games played by young people. And when you look over the past 2 generations, we've seen major changes in the way kids grow up. In the past, for example, in my generation, for every hour that I spent in an organized sport program, I probably spent 15 to 20 hours playing informal games. Mm-hmm. And my granddaughters now, for every hour that they spend in an informal game, they're spending 15 to 20 hours in organized sports. So we've seen a major shift, and it's related to, in many ways, the commercialization of sport and the fact that we use these commercial models of sports, and we have a word for that in sociology, prolympic sports. Oh. And in other words, it's a model based on professional and elite amateur sports. And those sports are now used as the standard against which all sport forms are measured and evaluated.
I always thought that safety kind of played into it. As I was growing up, there was a shift from just letting your kids run around and do whatever to kind of like, we need to keep an eye on you. There's bad people out there.
Yeah, and I think that awareness of the dangers in the world has increased with the way news has been covered. So when I was growing up and my kids were growing up, the first 5 stories on the local news were not about murders and abductions and child kidnapping and other kinds of issues like that. And interestingly, the world has gotten increasingly safer for young kids over the past 40 to 50 years, but the sense that it's dangerous for kids has increased tremendously over the past 40 to 50 years.
Yep. I think that's one of the most interesting things that historical sociological lens can offer people, is to look at those weird contradictions. In that, you're right, more people are actually safe today. There's relatively less wars. You're not shipping people off to Vietnam or Korea or something like that back in the 60s and 70s. So kids are safer today, but yet we are afraid to let them go play at the park or go down the street or play pickup, on their own. But we're also calling them snowflakes, and you have to wrap them in bubble wrap.
Right.
I have friends who do.
And we have to, when they scrape their knee, you have to immediately rush over and take care of them, and they can't do those things anymore. And now we have to, watch over them and regulate it. I mean, that's a, different context, but all within the kind of a sport or physical activity and, child movement studies, that those things don't make sense together in a safety.
And there's been some cultural changes that also have influenced that change, and one of them is that as we've emphasized individual responsibility to a greater extent in our social and political world, rather than government control over family life or over what children do, what we've seen is that parents and parental moral worth now is tied to what happens to their children. And so parents today are held responsible for the whereabouts and the behavior of their children 24/7, 365 days a year. And that is the first time in human history that parents have ever been held to that expectation. And it's driving parents crazy, and it's driving kids crazy too.
I can attest to that. It is driving us crazy, and I'm sure my kids will agree.
Yeah.
It's driving them crazy too.
So children are kept on a much shorter leash today by their parents than kids in the last number of generations, and parents are super sensitive to this. And so what they do is they try to find adult organized and adult supervised programs for their kids so that when they get out of school, they go to their youth sport practice or their dance lessons or their music lessons or their acting lessons where adults are in charge. And, parents feel that if they let their kids run around, go to the local park, that they're going to be in danger or that their kids are going to get into trouble. Mm-hmm. And if their kids get into trouble, who gets blamed? The parents. So now if a parent just lets their 10 and 12-year-old walk together to the park, somebody's going to call social services or the police. Right. And, it's gotten so bad in some communities that parents have gotten together and formed what they call free-range children clubs, where they actually get together and kids will support each other, but they actually allow their children to explore a little bit of the world on their own rather than being on this leash 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
I remember being so excited that I lived on a cul-de-sac. And I was so excited when my kids were able, and all the kids along the street went to the same school. Mm-hmm. And the school was down the street. They could walk to school. So I thought this was fantastic. They could actually have something similar to the way I grew up, where they could just go out, ride their bike, or go to their next door neighbor. I know you have kind of a similar situation with your kids, and it seems very odd. You almost have to think twice about it. It's like, is this safe? Because this is not normal, where it should be much more normal. And I remember the joy I felt, having my kids go, I'm going to Johnny's house, and them being able to have that kind of independence.
Right. And with that independence came the ability to be creative, to make up things that you wouldn't make up with adults around supervising you. And when you do that, you take ownership of your own activities and you get more joy out of them. And that really ties to what's happened with youth sports, because youth sports used to be neighborhood-based. Kids used to be able to ride their bikes. They didn't need parents to drive them to and from practices and games. And so now what's happened is that instead of communities sponsoring sports through park and recreation departments, what we have is parents and families are sponsoring sports. And that has had a major impact on how kids see their own sport participation. They see it as tied to their family rather than tied to their own community and neighborhood. And that has implications for how they grow up, how they see their connection to their own community and neighborhood. Those connections have become less obvious to young people than they were in the past. And I think that's impacted the extent to which we participate in our communities.
Yeah. Does any of that really matter too? Let's answer that question, right? At a practical level, that's a great observation, right? But does that really matter or make a difference? Today's age, okay, kids are playing less, but they've got more structure and we've got more opportunities for them. Things are better nowadays too. What do you say to something like that?
Well, maybe we don't have as many opportunities, and that's one of the things that's happened along with some of these changes is that a lot of our youth sport programs have become more segregated by social class because we have moved from low cost and free publicly funded programs that existed from the 1950s all the way through the 1970s and much of the 80s. And now we've moved to a pay-to-play private youth sports system that's much more exclusive, and your participation depends on your ability to pay. Mm-hmm. So what's happened is that kids from upper middle class and wealthier families have great access to youth sport participation opportunities, whereas kids in lower income groups don't. And what that has done is not only cut access for a good percentage of the young population, but it's also limited the pool of talent from which we can draw as kids get older and are trying out for high school and college and Olympic teams and professional teams. So what we're seeing is that the upper income kids are much more privileged in that process now, and that lower income kids, unless they have access to public school programs where they get some good coaching,
which there are fewer and fewer.
Yeah, then we're ending up with college programs being predominantly white and upper middle class, except for the revenue generating programs like football and men's basketball, women's basketball, and maybe a couple of others, ice hockey in some places. But all of the other sports are drawing from this pool of kids from upper income families. And the irony of it is that the revenues generated by those kids from the lower income families are actually funding the scholarships that the kids from upper income families have. So it's kind of this reverse welfare that we've got going on in sport programs right now.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more to make it clear that connection of how, let's say, football or men's basketball at the collegiate level is helping fund then the predominantly whiter sports of golf, tennis, lacrosse, swimming? Like, what do you mean by that? Like, how does that actually work?
Well, it works in a real clear-cut way in the Power Five conferences in the United States, where the big football and basketball media contracts that the schools and the conferences have are providing literally billions of dollars to those universities, and a good part of those billions of dollars are going to fund other sports within the athletic department. And so what you have are football and basketball players, men's players predominantly, half of whom are African American right now, are generating the revenues that provide support for most of the other sport programs within the university. Now, that model doesn't apply to all programs because a lot of football and basketball programs don't make money, but that's the way things are, at least in the top 65 to 75 schools in the universities in the country right now.
Has that changed much? I mean, I kind of always have thought that was the case.
Yeah.
Well, it's changed dramatically over the past 6 or 7 years with the big media contracts. And, college football and college basketball are major spectator events. They draw a lot of eyeballs. They also draw a lot of donors and boosters and alumni and others to focus their attention on their universities. And, over a number of years, it's a $2 billion contract. And so, for example, the schools in the Big Ten are getting $52 million a year.
Wow.
Just from their TV contracts. Now, about 20 to 30 million of that is spent by the football and basketball programs, but the other 20 to 30 million are going to fund the programs that are predominantly white with kids from predominantly upper income families.
How do you know that? What's your evidentiary claim? Where's your evidence for that claim?
Yeah, well, you can look at a lot of pictures in the
Turn on the TV, would you?
in the
Well,
book.
you gotta ask. I gotta ask the evidence side. You
Yes,
gotta be
you
scholars.
do.
We don't
Yeah.
just make things up, and people
Right.
are listening to, and they're gonna go, well, that's just his opinion, or well, I don't see that either. So there's evidence, and I know there's evidence too. So what is that evidence?
Yeah, the evidence is that we certainly know, because of the data gathered by universities, what racial and ethnic group people come from, and we also have information on the socioeconomic status of their families, and we know that the football and basketball players are coming from families generally that have lower incomes than divers and golfers and swimmers and lacrosse players and others.
Thanks for joining us on Sport Report. Make sure to like, subscribe, and get notified as part 2 of our conversation with Dr. Jay Coakley is waiting for you now. Check it out, and as always, we love to get your comments. Let's get this conversation started.